The world possesses a rhythm that exists far beneath the frantic pulse of human endeavor, a slow and inevitable tide that governs the turning of the stars and the falling of leaves. In the stillness that arrives when the clamor of the day finally retreats, there is a profound clarity to be found in the realization that nothing in this existence is meant to be held still. You might observe how the light shifts across a room, never resting in quite the same way twice, or how the very air is in a state of constant, invisible transit, much like the thoughts that weave through the mind without ever truly staying. We often move through our hours with the heavy illusion that we can grasp the present, attempting to freeze the fleeting moments of joy, or to anchor ourselves against the currents of change. Yet this very effort to possess the moment is what creates the friction of unrest. It is a fundamental truth of our nature that everything is in motion, from the vast cycles of the seasons to the quiet, internal shifts of our own identities. And this flux is not a flaw in the design of the world, but its very essence. There is a certain exhaustion that comes from the lifelong struggle to demand that the river flow backward or that the sun linger long after it has begun its descent, because suffering often arises not from the movement of life itself, but from the tightness of the grip used to resist it. We tend to categorize the movements of fortune as strictly good or bad, clinging to the heights of prosperity and recoiling from the shadows of loss. Yet the Stoics understood that these are merely the shifting winds of a world that remains indifferent to our preferences. To see the world as it is, rather than how we wish it to be, is to recognize that both the arrival and the departure are part of a singular, continuous process, and that to fight the nature of change is to fight the very fabric of reality. Even the things we hold most dear, those people and places that feel like permanent fixtures in the landscape of our souls, are part of this grand, restless choreography, moving through us and away from us in a pattern that is as beautiful as it is heartbreaking. Grief is perhaps the most universal of all human weather, a shared atmosphere that every soul must eventually navigate. Yet it is not an intruder in a life well lived, but rather a testament to the depth of our capacity to connect with the transient. When an ending occurs, it is easy to view it as a theft, a sudden deprivation that leaves us hollow. But there is another way to perceive the conclusion of things, seeing it not as a loss of something stolen, but as a completion of something that was always meant to have a beginning and a finitude. The Buddha once said, "All conditioned things are impermanent," a truth that serves as both a warning and a profound liberation. For if nothing is permanent, then no state of suffering is destined to endure, and no moment of beauty is lost forever to the void, but is instead transformed into the foundation of what comes next. There is a quiet, expansive peace that becomes accessible when the hands are no longer clenched in an attempt to hold on to the wind, but are instead opened to receive the world in its wholeness, accepting the ebb and the flow with a grace that recognizes the necessity of the passing. In this state of non-attachment, the self is not a fortress to be defended against change, but a vessel through which the universe expresses its endless, shifting complexity, allowing for a way of being that is at once deeply engaged with life and entirely unburdened by the fear of its inevitable conclusion. The night air carried the scent of damp stone and the metallic tang of an approaching rain, a coolness that settled over the city streets long after the heavy pulse of the evening rush had faded into a dull, distant hum. A woman walked with a slow, rhythmic step, her silhouette a solitary shape, moving through the pale yellow wash of the street lamps, her shoulders heavy with the invisible weight of the hours she had just endured. The hospital had been a place of sharp, clinical urgency, a labyrinth of beeping monitors, the frantic movement of white coats, and the profound, quiet gravity of those suspended between life and the threshold of the end. She had spent 12 hours navigating the delicate architecture of other people's pain, holding steady in the center of storms she could not calm, and witnessing the slow, inevitable unraveling of bodies and breath. She reached the old footbridge where the ironwork was pitted by decades of salt and wind, its structure a dark lace against the bruised purple of the sky. The bridge spanned a wide, ancient river that moved with a slow, muscular determination, a deep current that seemed to hold the secrets of the entire valley. She came to a halt in the middle of the span, leaning her weight slightly against the railing, watching the black water slide beneath her. The surface was never truly still. It was a moving tapestry of fractured light and shadow, carrying with it the debris of 1,000 different lives. She saw the occasional pale leaf, swirling in an eddy before being swept into the main current, and the distorted reflections of the lamps that danced upon the ripples, stretching and breaking into shimmering ribbons before vanishing into the dark. There was a certain immense indifference in the way the water moved, a relentless, unhurried momentum that did not pause to acknowledge the weight of the debris it carried or the darkness of the night. It did not struggle against the banks or attempt to hold on to the light. It simply accepted the flow, moving toward the sea with a quiet, unstoppable purpose. She watched a fallen branch tumble through a patch of lamplight, spinning slowly, its journey dictated by the unseen strength of the current. And she saw how the river did not try to fix the turbulence or settle the foam, but simply integrated every movement into its singular, continuous path. In the silence of the bridge, the clamor of the hospital, the cries, the sudden silences, the relentless ticking of the clocks seemed to lose its grip on the present, becoming something that was already moving away, something that was being carried downstream, even as she stood there. The day was not a thing that could be grasped or rewritten. It was a sequence of moments that had already passed into the current, flowing toward an ocean that was too vast to be known. By the time she turned to continue her walk toward her own door, the heaviness of the shift was no longer a thing she carried, but a thing that was already somewhere behind her, dissolving into the vast, moving dark of the river. The river does not seek permission to move, nor does it apologize for the silt it carries or the debris it gathers in its restless turns. It simply is, moving through the landscape with a profound, unyielding acceptance of what the moment provides. There is a certain grace in the way the water accepts the jagged edges of the stone and the sudden turbulence of the fallen branch, integrating the chaos into a singular, unfolding movement that eventually finds the stillness of the sea. You might find that the mind, too, functions in this way, a vast and shifting current that carries thoughts, memories, and anxieties like fragments of wood caught in a sudden swell. These thoughts are not the river itself. They are merely the contents of the stream, passing through the consciousness with their own peculiar weight and direction, yet they possess no power to halt the movement of the whole. The frantic urge to grasp at a passing thought, to hold on to a moment of clarity, or to push away a surge of sorrow is the very thing that creates the sensation of struggle, as if one could attempt to command the tide to stand still or force the clouds to cease their drifting. There is a quietude that emerges not when the noise of the world is silenced, but when the mind ceases its resistance to the noise that is already present. The clamor of existence, the relentless demands of time, the echoes of past regrets, the anticipations of a future that has not yet arrived, can be seen as nothing more than the surface foam of a much deeper, more silent reality. To witness the storm without becoming the storm, to watch the waves break against the shore without being swept away by their foam, is to begin to understand the nature of the self that remains constant beneath the movement. This self is not the frantic accumulation of roles, duties, or judgments, but the vast, unmoving space in which all these things arise and pass away. It is the silent witness to the internal weather, the one who observes the lightning and the rain without being struck by the bolt or drenched by the downpour. The weight of the world often feels heavy because of the way it is carried, as if every sorrow and every task were a stone meant to be held in the hands forever. Yet, the wisdom of the ages suggests that the burden is not the weight of the object, but the tension of the grip. When the hands are opened, the object remains, but the strain of holding it vanishes into the flow. There is a profound liberation in acknowledging that much of what causes suffering is the attempt to control the uncontrollable, the desire to impose a permanent order upon a world that is defined by its beautiful and inevitable impermanence. Everything that arises is in the process of departing. The joy is a guest that will eventually leave, and the grief is a shadow that must eventually dissolve into the light. To accept this transience is not to descend into a hollow nihilism, but to enter into a deeper intimacy with the reality of being alive, recognizing that the very fluidity of life is what allows for renewal and the possibility of peace. In the spaces between the thoughts, in the pauses between the breaths, there is a stillness that has always been there, waiting beneath the surface of the agitation. It is not a stillness that must be manufactured or sought through effort, but a stillness that is revealed when the constant striving for something other than what is currently happening begins to subside. The Buddha once said, "All conditioned things are impermanent." When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This turning away is not a flight from reality, but a movement toward the core of it, a recognition that the frantic search for stability in a changing world is a pursuit of shadows. When you stop trying to fix the river, you find that you are the river, and you are also the stillness that allows the river to flow. In this realization, the distinction between the observer and the observed begins to soften, leaving only the quiet, unfolding presence of the now, an ocean of being that remains undisturbed by the ripples on its surface. The weight of existence often feels like the heavy, unyielding struggle to grasp the wind, a desperate attempt to freeze the movement of a world that was born to change. There is a profound, quiet tragedy in the way a human heart seeks to build monuments out of moments, trying to anchor the shifting sands of circumstance into something permanent and predictable. You may find that much of the internal turbulence arises not from the movement of life itself, but from the friction created when your will collides with the inevitability of flux. We move through a landscape of constant transition, where the seasons turn without permission, and the people who walk beside us are also travelers on their own distinct, unrepeatable paths. To love something is to accept the inherent vulnerability of its being. For to love is to enter into a contract with impermanence, acknowledging that everything which has a beginning must also possess an end. When the tides of fortune shift, bringing with them the sudden arrival of loss or the unexpected shadow of misfortune, the instinct is to recoil, to tighten the grip on what was, or to demand that the current reverse its course. We categorize our experiences into the binary of good and bad, labeling the sunshine as a permanent state of being and the storm as an intruder to be banished. Yet the universe knows nothing of these distinctions. The storm is as much a part of the cycle as the light, and both are merely expressions of a vast, indifferent, and beautiful movement. To suffer is to demand that the world conform to a static image of how things should be, to wage a silent war against the very nature of reality. This resistance creates a secondary layer of pain, a suffering that is not caused by the passing of a person or a season, but by the refusal to allow that passing to occur. Grief is not an anomaly in the human experience, it is the shared weather of our existence, a fundamental climate that every soul must eventually navigate. It is the price of having been able to witness beauty, the natural consequence of having opened the self to the world. When an ending arrives, it often feels like a theft, as if something precious has been snatched away by a thief in the night, leaving the hands empty and the spirit hollow. Yet, if viewed through the lens of wholeness, an ending is rarely a theft. It is a completion, the natural closing of a circle that has played its part in the grand unfolding pattern. A life, a relationship, a season of prosperity. These are not objects to be possessed, but melodies to be heard, and a melody cannot be held in the hand, it can only be experienced as it rises, vibrates, and eventually fades into silence. There is a subtle, profound grace in the art of holding things with open hands, a way of being in the world that does not seek to possess, but simply to witness. When the hands are clenched tight, they cannot receive anything new, and they certainly cannot let anything go without a struggle that drains the very life they seek to protect. To hold with open hands is to acknowledge that you are a steward of the present moment, a temporary keeper of a flame that was lit long before you arrived and will continue to burn long after you have departed. This is not a coldness or a detachment that denies the depth of feeling, but a profound form of presence that allows the full spectrum of human experience to wash over you without being shattered by it. In this state of non-attachment, the self begins to expand. moving beyond the narrow, frantic identity that is defined by what it owns, who it knows, or how it is perceived. You are more than the sum of your circumstances. You are the vast, silent space in which all these shifting events occur. The storms may rage and the sun may shine. The fortunes may rise and the sorrows may deepen, but the underlying awareness remains untouched by the movement of the waves. There is a liberation in realizing that you do not need to control the direction of the wind to find peace. You only need to find the stillness that exists at the center of the turning world. This is the quietude that comes from surrendering the illusion of control and accepting the magnificent, terrifying, and holy reality of change. There was a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades building a small workshop of precision instruments, a place of quiet craft where the steady rhythm of filing and polishing had become the very pulse of his existence. He had founded it with a certain hope, a belief that if he only worked with enough discipline and integrity, the world would sustain him in return. But seasons change in ways that no craftsman can engineer, and a sudden, bitter downturn in the trade had folded the workshop in a single, relentless year. The loss of the business was the first arrow, a sudden and sharp strike that pierced his life with the weight of reality, leaving a bruise that was deep and undeniably real. It was a wound born of the world, an event that arrived without permission and left him standing in the wreckage of his plans. For 3 years following that collapse, he lived as if the wound were still fresh and bleeding, though the external cause had long since passed. He began to fire a second arrow into himself every single morning. He spent his hours in a silent, internal courtroom, endlessly replaying the final meetings and the difficult conversations, rehearsing different versions of himself that might have changed the outcome. He would sit in the stillness of his house and meticulously reconstruct the mistakes he had made, dissecting his own judgment with a cruelty he would never show a stranger. He refused to let the closed chapter remain closed, holding the memory of the business like a jagged piece of glass, pressing it against his palm to ensure he did not forget the pain. The toll of this second arrow was far more devastating than the first. His body began to fray. His sleep became a series of restless, fragmented movements, and the connection between him and his wife grew thin and translucent, like a veil of smoke that prevented them from truly touching. They sat across from one another at dinner, 2 people sharing a table, but separated by the vast, invisible distance of his preoccupation. He was physically present, but his spirit was perpetually anchored to a ghost, wandering through the halls of a defunct company, trying to fix a machine that had already been dismantled. The loss of the workshop had cost him a single year of labor, but the act of clinging to that loss was consuming the years that followed. Then came an ordinary morning when the light fell across the floor in a long, unhurried stripe, and he found himself watching the dust motes dance in the air. He realized, with a sudden and quiet clarity, that he had not thought of the workshop in a week. The memory of the business was still there, a faded photograph in the back of a drawer, but the frantic, agonizing need to rewrite the past had simply vanished. He looked at his hands, which were steady and still, and he understood at last that the weight he had been carrying for so long was not the weight of the business or the loss of his livelihood. The crushing pressure that had bent his spine and clouded his sight was not the first arrow, but the grip he had maintained on it, a hand clenched tight around a shadow that had no substance left to hold. It is a heavy thing, this tendency to carry the ghost of what has passed, as if it were a physical weight pressing against the chest. You might find that the mind behaves like a collector of ruins, gathering the broken shards of yesterday and trying to fit them back into a frame that no longer exists. There is a peculiar kind of suffering that arises when the intellect refuses to accept the finished nature of things, as if by thinking about a loss with enough intensity, the loss itself might be undone. This is the nature of the ego's struggle against the inevitable tide of change. It views the impermanence of all things as a personal affront, a glitch in the machinery of existence that must be corrected through sheer force of will. You may sense that life is a series of problems to be solved, a collection of grievances to be settled, or a debt of time that must be repaid through constant vigilance. Yet, the reality of the world is not a problem to be solved, but a process to be witnessed. The river does not struggle against the rocks it encounters. It simply flows around them, accepting the shape of the landscape as part of its own journey. To resist the flow of time is to attempt to hold the water in your hands, watching it slip through your fingers while you remain parched and exhausted by the effort. There is a profound distinction to be made between the event itself and the architecture of the thought that sustains it. The loss of a thing, a person, or a version of yourself is a singular moment in the stream of time, a ripple that moves through the water and then fades. However, the mind often takes that ripple and expands it into an ocean, building vast, stormy structures of regret and longing that occupy the entire horizon of your awareness. You are often not suffering from the event, but from the endless, repetitive loop of memory that reopens the wound each time it begins to scab over. This is the shadow work of the soul, the way the mind creates a second, more agonizing reality that sits alongside the true one. You might find yourself living in a house built of if-onlys and what might have been, a structure that has no foundation in the present, yet feels more real and more demanding than the ground beneath your feet. To stand within the current of existence without the need to grasp or to push back is the quietest form of courage. It is the recognition that the self is not a fixed monument, but a shifting confluence of thoughts, sensations, and perceptions that are constantly arising and passing away. You are the sky, not the weather. You are the vast, unchanging space in which the clouds of anxiety, the storms of anger, and the bright sunlight of joy move through their inevitable cycles. The clouds may be dark and heavy. They may obscure the sun for a time, but they never alter the fundamental nature of the sky itself. There is a profound stillness that exists beneath the turbulence of the thinking mind, a place that remains untouched by the frantic movements of the ego. This stillness is not found by silencing the thoughts, but by recognizing that you are the one who observes them. When you stop trying to master the waves, you realize that you are the depth of the sea, which remains tranquil even while the surface is tossed by the wind. The burden of the past is often a choice made in the name of loyalty to a version of yourself that has already died. We cling to our grievances and our identities as if they were anchors, fearing that if we let go, we will be swept away by the void. But the void is not an emptiness of nothingness. It is an emptiness of potential, a space of pure presence that is only accessible when the clutter of the self is set aside. The Buddha spoke of the nature of suffering, suggesting that it arises from the thirst for permanence in a world defined by flux. To seek stability in the external world is to build a house on shifting sands. To seek it within the movement of life itself is to find a center that cannot be moved. The weight you carry is not the truth of who you are, but the heavy, unnecessary armor you have donned to protect a person who no longer exists. In the quiet realization that nothing can be held forever, there is a sudden, unburdened lightness, a sense that you are finally permitted to simply exist, unattached and whole, in the grace of the present moment. It is a common error to view change as an intruder, a thief that arrives in the night to strip the garden of its bloom or the heart of its warmth. We often treat the passing of a season or the drifting away of a person as a personal affront, as if the natural movement of the cosmos were a failure of our own will. There is a profound, quiet exhaustion that comes from the attempt to freeze the river, to demand that the current stop so that we might walk upon the water and claim it as our own. This resistance, this white-knuckled grasp against the inevitable, is the true source of the ache that resides within the chest. It is not the loss itself that wounds, but the frantic, desperate struggle to maintain a stillness that was never meant to be. We find ourselves caught in a cycle of grasping for the sun while the shadows lengthen, forgetting that the light and the dark are part of the same celestial rhythm. The nature of fortune is similarly deceptive, appearing to us as a series of peaks and valleys that we attempt to navigate with the hope of permanent ascent. We label one moment as good and the next as bad, as if these states were solid ground rather than the crests of waves passing through an endless ocean. To believe that a season of ease is a permanent state is to invite a crushing despair when the tide inevitably turns. To believe that a season of sorrow is the final word is to deny the capacity for renewal. Wisdom suggests that neither the height nor the depth is the essence of the journey, but rather the capacity to remain centered amidst the constant flux of circumstance. When the distinction between favor and misfortune begins to blur, a certain peace emerges, a recognition that both are merely the weather of existence, passing through us without defining the sky. Grief, then, is not a malfunction of the soul or a sign that one has failed to grasp the truth of impermanence. It is the shared, sacred climate of being human. To love is to enter into a pact with transience, accepting from the very beginning that all things which arise must eventually dissolve. This is not a reason to love less, but perhaps a reason to love with a different kind of depth, one that does not require the object of affection to be a permanent fixture of our landscape. When we hold the people we cherish and the things we value with open hands, we honor their true nature as beautiful, moving, and finite. There is a peculiar, luminous strength in being able to witness a beautiful thing in its passing without the impulse to pull it into the past, allowing it to move through our lives with the grace of a guest. An ending is rarely a theft. It is often the natural completion of a pattern, a movement that has reached its inherent conclusion. We view an end as a void, yet in the grand architecture of existence, it is the necessary space that allows for what comes next to emerge. A story does not lose its meaning because the final page is turned. Rather, the meaning is found in the movement of the narrative from beginning to end. To see an ending as a completion is to step away from the frantic desire for eternal continuity and to step into the grace of the finished work. It is the recognition that everything is given, everything is lent, and everything is eventually returned to the source from which it sprang. In this state of non-attachment, the self is no longer a fortress to be defended, but a vessel through which life flows. We spend so much energy trying to curate a version of ourselves that is stable, consistent, and unshakable. Yet we are actually a continuous process of becoming, a series of vanishing moments that coalesce into a flickering identity. When you stop trying to be a static monument, you find that you are the space in which the dancing occurs. There is no longer a need to protect a fixed image, for the image is always changing, always shifting, always being reborn in the current moment. This realization does not diminish the self, but expands it, allowing the individual to feel connected to the vast, impersonal movement of the whole. There is a profound quietude that settles when the struggle against time ceases, a stillness that does not depend on the absence of movement, but on the cessation of resistance to it. It is the peace of the leaf that falls not because it is being pushed, but because its season has reached its natural conclusion. In this surrender, there is no loss of substance, only a loss of the heavy, artificial boundaries we have drawn around our experience. You are not the storm, nor are you the wreckage left in its wake. You are the vast, silent awareness that witnesses the wind and the rain with a sense of profound, unshakable belonging. To live in this way is to walk through the world with a light step, knowing that while nothing can be held, everything can be experienced in its full, fleeting glory. A young man once possessed a brightness that seemed to burn too hot for his skin, a restlessness that moved through his limbs like a river seeking the sea. He lived in a village tucked into the folds of a valley, a place where people measured their lives by what they could grasp, what they could hold, and what they could claim as their own. His grandfather was a man who seemed carved from the very mountain, a presence so quiet and still that the townspeople often wondered if he had ceased to be a person and had become instead a feature of the landscape. One afternoon, the boy returned to the cottage with a face flushed by a sudden, blinding fortune. He had won the village raffle, a sleek, silver machine of steel and glass that promised him the world on 4 wheels. The neighbors gathered in the square, their voices rising in a chorus of congratulations, speaking of his incredible luck and the bright path that had opened before him. The old man, sitting on his wooden bench as the sun dipped behind the ridge, looked up from his carving and spoke only a single word: maybe. The season turned, and with it, the silver car was seen tearing through the winding mountain roads, a streak of light against the green. The boy moved through the world with the heavy confidence of one who believes he has mastered the currents of fate. Then came the afternoon, when the sound of twisting metal echoed through the valley, a sharp, violent scream that broke the afternoon stillness. The car was a ruin, a heap of broken promises, and the boy lay amidst the wreckage with a leg shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The townspeople gathered again, their faces shadowed by pity, their words heavy with the weight of his misfortune and the cruelty of sudden calamity. They spoke of how terrible it was, how his luck had run dry and left him broken in the dust. The old man, watching the boy from the porch, looked toward the darkening horizon and said, "Maybe." As the weeks drifted by, the boy remained confined to a heavy cast, a prisoner of his own stillness, watching the world move on without him from the edge of the garden. His friends, the very ones who had spent months planning a great journey to the coast, gathered their things and set out in a heavy, dust-caked van, fueled by the freedom the boy had once held in his hands. They drove with the wind in their hair, chasing the horizon along the high, treacherous highway that skirts the cliffs. On a sharp bend, where the road turns toward the sky, a heavy freight truck lost its footing on the rain, slicked asphalt, and the van was struck with a force that defied description. The wreckage was absolute, a chaotic tangle of iron and life, leaving a void where a group of young men had been only moments before. News of the accident drifted back into the valley like a slow-moving fog, settling over the village with a sense of profound, terrible tragedy. The people wept for the loss of such vibrant life, speaking of the cruelty of a world that takes so much so suddenly. They looked at the boy, sitting in his chair with his leg bound in plaster, and they whispered about how miraculously lucky he was to have been left behind, spared by the very accident that had stolen his mobility. The old man, standing by the gate as the evening mist began to rise from the earth, looked at the stars beginning to prick through the velvet sky and said, "Maybe." There is a profound, unsettling truth in the way the world reveals its suddenness, a truth that mirrors the flickering movement of a candle flame against the dark. You might find that the most striking aspect of existence is not the permanence of things, but the way they are constantly in the process of vanishing, slipping through the fingers of perception like water or sand. This instability, which often feels like a betrayal of the heart, is the fundamental nature of all that is composed of form. We spend much of our lives building monuments to stability, attempting to construct a fortress of certainty out of the shifting sands of time, yet the very fabric of reality is woven from change. To see this is not to descend into despair, but to begin to understand the true texture of being. There is a quiet dignity in recognizing that the ebb and flow of life, with its sudden departures and unexpected arrivals, is not a series of errors, but the rhythm of a vast and impersonal movement. The weight of what is lost can feel like a physical pressure, a heaviness that pulls at the center of your being, because there is a natural impulse to grasp at what is fleeting. You might find yourself caught in a cycle of searching for a permanence that does not exist, trying to hold on to a moment or a person or a sense of self as if they were solid stone. This grasping is the source of much of the turbulence that passes through the mind. For when the object of your attachment inevitably shifts or fades, the friction between your desire and reality creates a profound ache. There is a wisdom that suggests a different way of relating to the world, one that does not demand that things stay as they are, but accepts the inherent transience of every encounter. This is not a cold or detached indifference, but a spacious kind of presence that allows things to come and to go without the need to bind them to the self. When the unexpected occurs, when the suddenness of life leaves a void, the mind often rushes to find meaning, to demand a reason, or to judge the event as either good or evil. Yet, the nature of the universe is often far beyond the reach of human categorization. A storm is not cruel for breaking the branches of a tree. A season is not unkind for turning the green leaf to brown. The light does not apologize for the shadows it creates. To observe these movements without the immediate need to label them as injustices is to find a center that remains still even when the external world is in chaos. You are more than the events that befall you. You are the vast, silent space in which these events unfold. There is a difference between being the storm and being the sky that contains it. The sky remains whole and unbroken, regardless of the lightning that streaks across its expanse, or the clouds that obscure its light. In the midst of great loss or sudden change, there is often a sense of being fractured, as if the self has been broken by the weight of what has occurred. However, the deeper truth revealed in moments of profound transition is that the essence of your being is not defined by what is taken away. The things that pass, the bodies we inhabit, the roles we play, the thoughts that race through the mind, are all part of the dance of impermanence, a continuous stream of becoming and ceasing. If you can find the part of yourself that observes these changes, the part that remains steady while the world turns, you touch something that is not subject to the whims of fortune. This is the peace that resides in the realization that you do not need to control the river to understand the water. You can simply sit on the bank and witness the flow, knowing that the river is always moving, always changing, and always in its own way whole. The mystery of existence lies in this very paradox, that in the very heart of change there is a continuity, and in the very center of loss there is the capacity for a presence that is never truly lost. The seasons themselves offer a silent testimony to this constant movement, turning from the vibrant green of growth to the brittle gold of decay, without any struggle against the inevitable shift. There is a profound truth in the way a leaf does not fight the wind that carries it away, nor does the tide protest the moon that pulls it back into the depths. They move in accordance with a rhythm that is larger than their individual form. Much of the weight we carry arises from the quiet, desperate demand that the present moment should freeze, that the person we love should remain unchanged, or that a season of prosperity should never yield to the shadow of winter. This resistance to the natural law of flux is the source of the friction that we experience as suffering, for we try to grasp at water with clenched fists, only to find that our hands are empty and our strength is spent. To see that life is a series of arrivals and departures is not to embrace a cold nihilism, but to recognize the fundamental nature of all things that are born. Fortune and misfortune are not fixed points on a map, but are instead like the weather, passing through a landscape without ever becoming the landscape itself. One day the sun may warm the skin, and the next, the storm may lash the earth. Yet the earth remains, enduring both with a silent, patient presence. To label a moment as purely good or purely bad is to try to impose a static morality upon a world that is in a state of perpetual becoming. Even grief, which often feels like a sudden intrusion or a cruel theft, is a shared weather that every soul must eventually navigate. It is the price of having loved, the natural consequence of having opened oneself to the beautiful, terrifying vulnerability of being alive. When an ending arrives, it is not necessarily a theft of what was, but rather a completion of what was meant to be, a movement toward a conclusion that was inherent in the very first moment of the beginning. There is a certain grace that emerges when the hands are no longer clenched in an attempt to hold on to the passing, but are instead held open to receive both the gift and the loss. This openness does not mean that nothing matters, but rather that we understand the preciousness of things precisely because they are fleeting. The beauty of a flower is inseparable from its eventual wilting, and the sweetness of a song is contained within its eventual silence. When we stop trying to anchor ourselves to the shifting tides of circumstance, we find that we are not actually being swept away, but are instead part of the movement itself. Within this movement, there exists a subtle and steady home for awareness, a sanctuary that is not found by traveling far or seeking something new, but by recognizing what has always been present. The body serves as this quiet vessel, a living architecture of sensation, and sensation through which the world is known, acting as a constant pulsing anchor in the midst of a racing mind. Even when thoughts rise like turbulent waves upon the surface of the sea, the depth of the ocean remains still, and the body is the medium through which that stillness can be sensed. The breath, in its rhythmic, involuntary rise and fall, is the most fundamental expression of this continuous cycle of taking in and letting go, a constant mirror of the universe's own expansion and contraction. It is a subtle, internal tide that marks the passage of time without ever requiring a single word to explain its purpose. To observe the breath is to witness the very mechanics of impermanence, a constant coming and going that requires no effort to maintain, yet sustains the entirety of existence. It is the most basic bridge between the internal self and the external world, a thread of continuity that connects the moment of birth to the moment of departure. In the quietude of this observation, one may find that the mind, which often feels like a frantic wanderer, is actually a guest in a much larger and more stable house. The thoughts that drift through the consciousness, the anxieties about the future, the regrets of the past, the judgments of the self, are merely clouds passing through a vast and open sky. The sky does not need to struggle against the clouds, nor does it become the clouds when they turn dark. It simply provides the space for them to be. This space is the true nature of being, a profound and unshakable presence that remains even when the external world is in total upheaval. It is a place of radical acceptance, where the reality of what is can be met without the immediate need to change it or flee from it. To dwell in this awareness is to realize that you are not the storm, nor are you the wind, but the vastness in which the storm occurs. This realization brings a quietude that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a deep and abiding equilibrium, a sense that despite the constant flux of life, there is a center that is never truly moved. It is the recognition that being is not something to be achieved or earned, but something that is being continuously offered, a continuous unfolding that requires nothing from us but our willingness to witness it. The mountain was a tapestry of deep greens and heavy, mist-laden grays, the kind of landscape that feels ancient and indifferent to the passage of time. A woman moved through this silence, her boots pressing into the soft, yielding earth of the trail, her mind a restless hive of unfinished conversations and the quiet anxieties of a life lived in anticipation of the next thing. She was thinking of the house she had left behind, of the letters she had yet to write, and of the persistent, low-frequency hum of 1,000 small responsibilities that never truly cease their vibration. The forest was damp from a recent rain, the air thick with the scent of pine needles and wet stone, a world that seemed to be breathing in rhythm with her own hurried, shallow steps. The descent was steep, a sudden fracture in the steady path, where the earth had simply given way to the gravity of the slope. There was no great crash, only the sudden, sickening loss of footing as the moss-slick soil disintegrated beneath her weight. She felt the terrifying, breathless pull of the void before her hands had even found their grip. In that momentary suspension of the world, there was only the sensation of falling, a violent departure from the stability of the path. Then, the jarring impact of her weight against something unyielding, a thick, gnarled root that had woven itself deep into the heart of the cliffside. She hung there, suspended between the solid earth above and the long, dark shadow of the ravine below. Her fingers were white and strained, locked around the rough bark, the muscles in her arms trembling with the sheer effort of remaining attached to the world. The silence of the forest had changed. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a walk, but the heavy, pressurized stillness of a life held in the balance. Her mind, which had been a frantic storm of past regrets and future terrors, began to pulse with a singular, sharp rhythm, the desperate, instinctive demand for survival. As she hung there, the world narrowed to the diameter of her own grip and the terrifying distance beneath her boots. Yet, in the midst of this extremity, her gaze drifted to a small, impossible detail, just inches from her face. There, protruding from a crack in the limestone, was a single wild strawberry. It was a startling, vibrant red against the gray and brown of the stone, a tiny, glowing ember of life that seemed to have captured the very essence of the sun. It was impossibly bright, an anomaly of color in a world of shadow. The absurdity of it reached her through the fog of her panic. She saw the fruit, so small and delicate, thriving in a place where nothing was meant to grow, clinging to the very edge of nothingness with a quiet, unthinking persistence. A strange, quiet curiosity overrode the scream in her mind. She shifted her weight just enough to bring her lips to the berry, and when she tasted it, the universe underwent a sudden, luminous transformation. It was not merely sweet, it was the concentrated essence of summer, of warmth, and of the earth's secret joy. The flavor was so intense, so vivid and complete, that it seemed to consume the entirety of her being. The mountain, the fall, the fear, and the long, uncertain road ahead vanished into that single, radiant point of sweetness on her tongue. The sudden, piercing clarity of that single taste suggests that the vastness of the world is often found, not in the sweeping vistas we strive to conquer, but in the microscopic intersections of being that occur when the mind ceases its frantic flight toward the future or its heavy mourning for the past. It is a quiet truth that the overwhelming weight of existence, with all its jagged edges and looming shadows, can be held by the soul when the perception shifts from the abstract to the immediate. When the mind is caught in the storm of its own making, it often forgets that it is not the storm itself, but the vast, unmoving sky that contains it. The turbulence of thought, the rushing currents of anxiety, and the relentless noise of self-judgment are merely weather passing through a much larger and more permanent space. There is a profound distinction between the movement of the weather and the stillness of the atmosphere. Just as there is a distinction between the transient flicker of a thought and the enduring quality of the awareness that witnesses it. In the wisdom of the ancient paths, it is understood that the struggle to control the uncontrollable is the primary architect of human suffering. We spend our lives attempting to build dams against the river of change, trying to freeze the flowing water into a static, predictable shape. Yet the river must flow, and the seasons must turn, and all things that arise must eventually dissolve. This impermanence is not a cruelty to be endured, but the very fabric of reality through which all beauty is permitted to exist. If the strawberry did not bloom and fade, its sweetness would have no context. If the moment were not fleeting, it could never be truly encountered. The sting of loss is often just the shadow cast by our own attachment to things as they were, rather than as they are. To witness the world as it unfolds, without the desperate need to grasp or to push away, is to touch the hem of a peace that does not depend on external circumstances. The body serves as a silent, grounding vessel for this awareness, a physical anchor in the shifting sands of perception. It is the place where the abstract meets the tangible, where the intellect's endless questions meet the simple, rhythmic reality of being alive. The very mechanics of life, the subtle rise and fall that sustains the organism, operate with a quiet, unthinking intelligence that requires no direction and no effort. This rhythm is a constant, a fundamental pulse that exists beneath the layer of mental chatter, a steady cadence that remains even when the mind is lost in a labyrinth of its own construction. It is a home that is always present, a sanctuary of sensation that exists in the immediate now, offering a sense of belonging to the world that is not contingent upon achievement or status. There is a wholeness in the self that includes both the light of conscious thought and the deep, unexamined shadows of the subconscious. Often, the effort to be only the light, to be only the calm, the rational, and the composed, only serves to deepen the tension within the psyche. True presence involves an integration of the entire being, a recognition that the darkness is as much a part of the human landscape as the dawn. To accept the totality of the experience, the joy and the terror, the sweetness and the bitterness, is to move through the world with a grace that is not fragile. It is to realize that you are the space in which all these things occur, the silent witness to the drama of life, untouched by the characters in the play. In this witnessing, the boundary between the self and the universe begins to soften, revealing a continuity that is often obscured by the ego's insistence on its own separation. The universe is not something to be observed from the outside, but a process in which you are an intrinsic and inseparable participant, a single note in an infinite, unfolding melody. There is a profound restlessness in the human heart, a quiet, persistent ache that seeks to build monuments out of sand, to freeze the sunlight in a jar, to command the rivers to cease their winding journey toward the sea. We move through life as if we were collectors of moments, attempting to grasp the fleeting beauty of a blooming flower or the warmth of a hand held in ours, only to find that the very act of grasping is what creates the sting of loss. This tension arises from a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to exist, for we often mistake the river for something static when it is, in truth, a constant state of becoming, never the same twice, even as it maintains the illusion of a singular identity. The seasons do not struggle against their turning, nor does the moon mourn its waning. Yet the human spirit often finds itself at odds with the rhythm of the world, demanding that the winter never arrive and that the summer never fade. It is a heavy burden to carry the weight of a world that is in constant, unceasing motion. Yet the suffering that accompanies this movement is rarely born from the change itself, but rather from the desperate white-knuckled grip we maintain against the inevitable. We treat the shifting of circumstances, the changing of fortunes, and the passing of seasons as personal affronts, as if the movement of the universe were a betrayal of our individual desires. When we label a moment as purely good or another as purely bad, we create a fracture in our experience, a resistance that turns the natural flow of life into a turbulent struggle. Fortune and misfortune are not opposing forces in a war, but rather the rising and falling of a single tide, a continuous ebb and flow that defines the very nature of existence. To see this is to understand that what we call luck or fate is merely the dance of causality, an intricate web of causes and effects that operates far beyond the narrow scope of our individual control. The people who enter our lives, the objects we cherish, and the very cells of our own bodies are all subject to this same law of flux. Nothing is possessed, only borrowed for a time. Even the self, that central protagonist in the drama of our lives, is not a solid, unchanging entity, but a swirling confluence of memories, perceptions, and biological processes that are ever shifting. We cling to a version of ourselves that no longer exists, mourning a past self, even as we struggle to maintain a current one, forgetting that we are a process rather than a product. This realization can feel like a profound emptiness, a terrifying dissolution of the boundaries that give us a sense of security. Yet it is within this very dissolution that a deeper, more expansive reality begins to emerge. When the illusions of permanence are stripped away, what remains is not a void, but a vastness that is capable of holding everything without the need to possess it. Grief, in all its heavy and complicated forms, is not an aberration of the human experience, but its most universal and shared weather, a rain that falls upon every soul that has ever known love. To grieve is to acknowledge the depth of the connection that once was, and in doing so, to honor the sanctity of the experience itself. We often view an ending as a theft, a sudden deprivation that leaves us hollow, but there is another way to perceive the conclusion of a thing, as a completion rather than a loss. A song is defined by its final note, a story by its resolution, and a season by its passing. Without the end, there could be no beginning, and without the movement, there could be no life. An ending is a thing fully given, a cycle that has played out its intended movement within the grander tapestry of time. When we stop trying to hold the water in our hands and instead learn to swim in the stream, the frantic energy of resistance begins to subside, replaced by a quiet, luminous clarity. There is a certain grace in the realization that we are not the masters of the tide, but merely travelers upon it, and that our task is not to stop the waves, but to find our balance amidst them. This does not require a coldness or an indifference to the beauty of the world, but rather a shift in how we relate to it, moving from the posture of the collector to the posture of the witness. To hold what is precious with open hands is to experience a different kind of intimacy, one that is not predicated on the fear of loss, but on the profound appreciation of presence. When the hand is open, it can receive the gift of the moment without the immediate anxious thought of its departure. It can cherish the warmth of the sun without the desperate need to trap its heat. This openness does not diminish the value of what we encounter, but it removes the shadow of anxiety that often obscures the brilliance of the now. We find that we can love deeply without the crushing weight of attachment, experiencing the world in its full, vibrant complexity without being shattered by its inevitable transformations. In this state of non-attachment, the boundaries of the ego begin to thin, and the distinction between the observer and the observed starts to dissolve into a singular, breathing continuity. We begin to see that the same energy that moves the stars and pulls at the tides is the same energy that animates our own thoughts and pulses through our veins. We are not isolated islands in a vast, indifferent ocean, but waves that are an inherent part of the ocean itself, momentarily rising in a unique shape before returning to the depths. This realization brings a profound sense of belonging, a quiet reassurance that even when we feel most alone, we are part of a movement that is ancient, eternal, and infinitely whole. The vastness does not demand our control. It only asks for our presence, inviting us to witness the unfolding of the universe with a heart that is both tender and unshakable. A woman once walked through the village with a heaviness that seemed to pull the very air toward her, a weight so profound it felt as though she were carrying a stone within her chest. She had lost a child, a small life that had been the center of her universe, and the silence left behind was a roar that she could not quiet. She sought out the healers and the scholars, moving from one doorway to another, offering her gold and her prayers, begging for a way to undo the unraveling of her world. Her grief was a constant companion, a shadow that refused to retreat even when the sun was at its zenith. Eventually, she came to a man who lived in quiet seclusion, a teacher known to many as the Buddha. She knelt before him, her spirit frayed by the relentless tide of her mourning, and asked if there was any medicine in all the world that could bring back what had been taken. The Buddha looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold the stillness of a mountain lake and told her that he could indeed provide the cure, but it would require a very specific ingredient. He said she must find him a single mustard seed from a household that had never been touched by loss, a home where no one had ever known the sting of death or the hollow ache of grieving. Relief surged through her like a sudden warmth, and she rose with a newfound purpose, her mind already racing through the streets to find such a sanctuary. She went first to a house where a family sat together by a hearth, the light flickering against the walls in a gentle rhythm. She asked the father if they had a mustard seed and if their home had been spared the shadow of loss. The man smiled kindly and reached into a small pouch, but as he spoke, his eyes grew distant and heavy. He confessed that they had lost a son to the winter fever many years before. The woman moved on, her heart fluttering with a desperate hope, approaching a house where a young mother was singing to a child. The mother offered a seed with a graceful gesture, but when the question of loss was posed, she spoke softly of a grandfather who had passed in the night, her voice carrying a quiet, practiced sorrow. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, violet shadows across the dusty paths, she moved from door to door with increasing urgency. She visited the wealthy estates and the humble cottages, seeking the one house that remained pristine and untouched by the fragility of life. At every threshold, she found a different version of the same story. She met a man who had buried a wife, a woman who had lost a sibling, and an old man who had watched his only daughter depart from this world. Each house was a vessel of warmth and light, yet each also held a secret chamber of mourning. By the time the first stars began to pierce the deepening blue of the twilight, her hands were empty of seeds, but her mind had begun to shift. The isolation of her pain, which had felt like a vast and lonely desert, was being replaced by a different realization. She saw that the grief she carried was not a singular storm that had struck her alone, but the very atmosphere in which all human beings lived. The sorrow was not a wall that separated her from the world, but a thread that wove every soul into a single, continuous tapestry of shared experience. In the gathering dark, she found that the commonality of suffering was a strange kind of company, a quiet truth that made the weight of her own heart feel less like a solitary burden and more like a part of the human weather. The realization that grief is not an intruder, but the very climate of existence, carries a quiet, devastating beauty. It is a truth that often remains hidden beneath the surface of a frantic life, obscured by the desperate attempt to build something permanent, something that might withstand the relentless movement of time. You may find that the most profound struggle is the resistance to the fact that everything which arises must also pass away, the insistence that a moment, a person, or a feeling should remain fixed even as the world turns on its axis. There is a certain exhaustion that comes from trying to grasp the wind, from trying to hold the river steady so that one might study its surface without the interruption of the current. Yet, the current is the only thing that is real. The river is not the water that flows through it, but the movement itself. Similarly, life is not the accumulation of static possessions or the preservation of a single, unchanging self, but the continuous unfolding process of becoming and unbecoming. To witness this movement is to see that impermanence is not an enemy to be defeated, but the very condition that allows for anything to ever exist at all. If the season did not turn, the seed can never find the strength to break its shell. If the breath did not depart, there would be no space for the next to arrive. This constant shifting is the rhythm of the universe, a grand, unhurried dance of presence and absence that operates without judgment and without preference. When the mind clings to the idea of permanence, it creates a friction with reality, a subtle but persistent tension that manifests as the heavy ache of anxiety or the sharp sting of loss. This tension arises because the ego seeks to stand outside of time, to carve out a sanctuary of stability in a world defined by flux, forgetting that the seeker and the sought are both subject to the same laws of change. There is a vastness that exists beyond the reach of these individual fluctuations, a space that remains untouched by the rising and falling of tides or the passing of empires. In the quietude of deep reflection, one might perceive that you are not the storm, nor are you even the vessel being tossed by the waves. You are the vast, silent expanse in which the storm occurs. The thoughts that race through the mind, the anxieties that pull at the edges of the consciousness, the heavy shadows of past regrets, and the bright, flickering lights of future hopes, these are all transient phenomena, like clouds passing across a summer sky. They are real in their movement, yet they are not the sky itself. The sky does not struggle against the cloud. It does not attempt to hold the rain or push away the thunder. It simply provides the space for them to be, remaining clear and immense regardless of the weather passing through it. In this perspective, the loneliness that often feels so absolute begins to dissolve into a different kind of connection. When you recognize that the boundaries of the self are porous, that the distinction between the observer and the observed is a subtle illusion of the mind, the weight of being an isolated entity begins to lighten. The suffering of another is not a foreign event, but a variation of the same melody that plays within your own heart. To see this is to move from a state of judgment into a state of profound, wordless compassion. It is the realization that the human condition is a shared architecture of vulnerability, a beautiful and tragic necessity of being alive. As the Buddha once observed, all conditioned things are impermanent, a truth that serves not as a cause for despair, but as a gateway to a profound and unshakable peace. This peace does not come from the cessation of change, but from the cessation of the struggle against it, from the quiet acceptance that to be alive is to be part of a beautiful, unfolding mystery that requires no grasping, only a steady, witnessing presence. The river does not seek to hold the water that has already passed its banks, nor does the mountain mourn the snow that has melted into the valley below. They exist within a constant state of becoming, a seamless movement that requires no resistance to be complete. It is a common error of the human spirit to mistake the temporary for the eternal, to build monuments of the mind in an attempt to freeze a moment that was always meant to flow through us like light through a prism. We often move through our days with clenched fists, trying to grasp the edges of a season, the warmth of a conversation, or the very shape of the person we believe ourselves to be. Yet this very act of grasping is the source of the friction that we mistake for life itself. The tension arises not from the fact that things end, but from the silent, relentless demand that they should not, a stubborn insistence that the current should stop and pool into a stagnant lake of our own making. There is a profound and heavy beauty in the way the world moves, a rhythm that encompasses both the blossoming of the flower and the inevitable decay of the fallen leaf. To understand this is to see that loss is not a sudden rupture in the fabric of existence, but a natural thread being woven into the pattern. When something we love departs, it can feel as though a part of our own identity has been stolen, a theft committed by time and circumstance. Yet this perception is a shadow cast by the intensity of our attachment. If we view life as a collection of possessions to be guarded, then every passing moment becomes a potential bereavement, a slow erosion of everything we have worked to secure. But if life is viewed instead as a series of encounters, a sequence of gifts that are lent to us rather than given to us, the nature of loss begins to shift from a tragedy of deprivation to a quiet recognition of completion. An ending is not an interruption of a story, but the necessary conclusion that gives the story its meaning. Just as a melody requires the silence between the notes to be heard, so too does the experience of being alive require the presence of endings to define the boundaries of our joys. To hold something with an open hand is to honor its true nature, acknowledging that its beauty lies in its very transience, its fleeting dance within the light before it returns to the darkness from which it emerged. Even the self, that central narrator we cling to so fiercely, is a shifting landscape of thoughts, sensations, and memories, a continuous process of arriving and departing that never truly stays still for a single heartbeat. To demand stability from a universe defined by flux is to invite a profound and wearying exhaustion, a struggle against the very laws that allow life to exist. This struggle often turns inward, manifesting as a relentless internal critic that judges the self for its fragility, its errors, and its inability to remain constant and composed. We carry the weight of our past versions like heavy stones, mourning the person we used to be, or lamenting the person we failed to become, forgetting that the one who observes these thoughts is not the thoughts themselves. There is a deep and necessary compassion required for the part of you that feels lost, the part of you that fears the coming winter or the changing tides of fortune. This compassion is not a way to fix the self, but a way to stop the war against the self. It is the recognition that you are part of the same unfolding movement that moves the stars and the tides, a participant in a cosmic dance that includes both the heights of triumph and the depths of sorrow. Fortune and misfortune are not fixed points on a map, but waves on a vast and unpredictable sea. To label one as purely good and the other as purely evil is to misunderstand the nature of the ocean, which requires both the crest and the trough to maintain its motion. When we cease to categorize the movements of life as enemies to be fought or allies to be pursued, a certain stillness begins to emerge. Not the stillness of a vacuum, but the stillness of a center point in a turning storm. This is the wisdom of the observer, the ability to witness the turbulence of circumstance without being swept away by the current, knowing that the water will always find its level and the wind will always find its rest. Grief, in its many forms, is the shared weather of the human experience, a storm that passes through every soul that has ever known love. It is the price of admission for the privilege of connection, the shadow cast by the light of our attachments. To resist the grief is to resist the love that caused it, creating a secondary layer of suffering that is entirely unnecessary. When we allow ourselves to sit within the reality of what is, without the immediate impulse to change it or escape it, we find that the weight of the world becomes more bearable, not because the world has changed, but because our relationship to it has found a new equilibrium. There is a quiet dignity in the acceptance of the ephemeral, a strength that is found not in the hardness of stone, but in the yielding of the willow that bends in the gale but does not break. In the space where we no longer try to hold the wind in our hands, we find a capacity for a much deeper kind of presence, one that does not depend on the stability of our surroundings or the permanence of our circumstances. It is a presence that is at home in the transition, at peace in the middle of the movement, and whole even in the midst of loss. By releasing the need for things to be different than they are, we stop being victims of change and become participants in it, finding in the very flow of impermanence a sense of belonging to the infinite. This is the quiet that comes when the grasping ceases, the peace that arises when we realize that we are not the things we hold, nor the things that leave us, but the vast and silent awareness in which all things rise and fall. The sun was a pale, heavy gold as it hung over the coastline, casting long, amber shadows across the dunes where a woman and her grandson spent their afternoons. The sand was cool and damp under their hands, a textured canvas of gray and pearl that felt substantial and real as they worked. They were building a kingdom of immense complexity, a sprawling architecture of mounds and ridges that seemed to defy the vastness of the ocean. The child, with hands stained by the salt and the grit, worked with a fierce, trembling intensity to carve out tiny, arched windows and a deep, winding moat that encircled the central keep. They found the finest, most iridescent shells to serve as ornaments, pressing them into the walls with the reverence one might afford a cathedral. It was a labor of pure devotion, a concentrated effort to create something that felt permanent in a world of shifting light and moving water. When the tide finally began its inevitable return, the ocean did not arrive with a roar, but with a rhythmic, persistent creeping, a slow encroachment of white foam that sought out the low places. The first wave breached the moat with a soft, sighing sound, dissolving the delicate trenches and turning the base of the towers into a slurry of gray silt. The child stood up, the small face contorted by a sudden, sharp fury, and looked toward the horizon as if the sea were a thief that had arrived to commit a crime. There were cries of protest, a sense of profound injustice that such a magnificent creation could be erased by a mindless, rhythmic movement of the water. The woman did not move to shield the child, nor did she try to explain the mechanics of the moon or the pull of the gravity that drove the tides. She simply sat in the sand, her hands resting loosely in her lap, watching the water with a quiet, steady gaze. She spoke only once, her voice barely a ripple against the sound of the surf, noting that the sea was simply being the sea, and that the purpose of the castle had always been in the making, never in the keeping. The following summer arrived with a heat that shimmered over the salt spray, and they returned to the same stretch of shore with the same devotion to the task at hand. The child was taller now, the movements of those small hands more deliberate and less frantic, yet the effort remained just as immense. They built a citadel of such intricate detail that the wind seemed to whisper through its imaginary halls, a structure of towers and ramparts that stood defiant against the vast blue expanse. When the first wave arrived, a gentle, frothing tongue of water that licked at the foundations, the expected storm of grief did not come. Instead, there was a soft, bright sound of laughter that rose from the child, a recognition of the absurdity and the beauty of the moment. They sat together, side by side, as the tide began its slow, methodical reclamation of the shoreline. They watched the walls lose their shape, the tower softening into mounds, the moat filling with the very sea it had tried to hold at bay, until the entire kingdom was nothing more than a smooth, dark expanse of wet sand reflecting the sky like a mirror. The watching was not a hollow substitute for the building, it was the culmination of it, a quiet witnessing of the return to the whole, as the child looked at the empty space where the castle had been and found it was enough to have known it for a while. The tide comes for everything eventually, pulling at the edges of the structures we labor to build, whether they are made of sand or of the heavy, intricate architecture of the ego. There is a profound, quiet tragedy in the way the mind seeks to fortify itself against the inevitable, attempting to construct permanent monuments out of the shifting debris of experience. You spend a lifetime gathering stones, stacking them one by one in an attempt to create a sense of self that is solid, unmoving, and protected from the eroding winds of change. It is a natural impulse to grasp at these shapes, to hold them tightly against the chest when the water begins to rise, fearing that if the form is lost, the substance of who you are will vanish along with it. Yet, there is a vastness that exists beyond the silhouette of the castle, a truth that remains even when the walls have dissolved into the dark, wet sand. This truth is the realization that you are not the fortress, nor are you the ruins that remain when the storm passes. You are the space in which the building occurs, the silent witness to the rising and falling of every wave. To witness the dissolution of something cherished without the reflexive tightening of the spirit is perhaps the most subtle and difficult form of grace. It is the recognition that the beauty of the castle was never found in its permanence, but in the very fact that it was built at all. A temporary flowering of intention in a world of constant flux. When the water rushes in, it does not come to destroy, but to complete the cycle, returning the borrowed elements of the sand and the salt to the great, unformed unity of the sea. To struggle against this return is to fight against the very nature of reality, a labor that yields only exhaustion and a deepened sense of isolation. There is a profound, hidden compassion in allowing the tide to do its work, a gentleness that begins when you stop treating your own impermanence as a failure of will. This is not a surrender to despair, but a surrender to the truth, a way of being that finds peace not by controlling the elements, but by understanding your place within them. The shadow of self-judgment often arises from the belief that we should be more stable, more enduring, more capable of holding on to the things we love. We judge ourselves for the way our thoughts drift, for the way our anxieties rise like sudden swells, and for the way we inevitably lose the grip we thought we had on our lives and our identities. We view these shifts as cracks in our foundation, as evidence of weakness, yet they are merely the movement of life itself. There is a wholeness that can only be accessed when the grip is loosened, when the frantic effort to maintain a certain shape is replaced by a quiet, steady presence. It is in the moments when the structure has crumbled, when the sand has been smoothed by the rhythmic movement of the water, that the horizon becomes clearest. You find that you are not diminished by what has been taken away. Rather, you are expanded by the space that has opened up in its place. There's a stillness that waits on the other side of the grasping, a quietude that is not the absence of movement, but the end of the struggle against it. In this stillness, the distinction between the builder and the building begins to soften, and the perceived boundary between the self and the world loses its sharp, painful edges. You begin to see that the very things you tried so hard to protect were always part of the same, flowing movement that sustains the stars and the tides alike. To live with this understanding is to walk through the world with a lighter step, no longer burdened by the need to defend a fragile and temporary kingdom. You become a participant in the unfolding, a part of the vast, unhurried dance of existence, finding that the most enduring thing you can hold is the capacity to simply be, present and unattached, as the waves wash over the shore and the world returns, as it always must, to its beautiful, nameless wholeness. The river does not struggle against the stones that break its surface, nor does the season mourn the leaves. It must shed to make room for the frost. There is a profound, unyielding movement in the fabric of all things, a constant shifting of form and shadow that dictates the rhythm of every living thing. We often find ourselves attempting to build monuments out of smoke, reaching with a desperate strength to grasp the hem of a moment that has already begun to slip into the past. We treat the people we love and the fortunes we have gathered as if they were permanent fixtures of our landscape, forgetting that they are more like the light upon a moving stream, beautiful and vivid, yet inherently transient. This friction, this frantic attempt to freeze the dance of existence, is the origin of much of the ache that settles in the chest. It is the pain of a hand clenched tight around a handful of sand, where the very act of holding is what causes the loss. If one were to look closely at the nature of change, the distinction between a beginning and an end begins to lose its harsh, jagged quality. We tend to view loss as a theft, a sudden robbery by time that leaves us diminished and hollowed out, yet an ending is often merely the completion of a pattern, the natural folding of a story that was always meant to have its final page. When a thing reaches its conclusion, it is not being taken away so much as it is being fulfilled, returning to the great, nameless source from which all forms emerge and to which all forms must inevitably return. Even the most cherished circumstances, the peaks of joy and the valleys of sorrow, are part of the same undulating terrain. They flow through us like the weather, arriving with their own internal logic and departing when their purpose is served. To label a season of life as purely good or purely bad is to misunderstand the vast impersonal movement of the cosmos, which knows nothing of our desires or our fears, but only of the necessity of transition. Grief, then, is not an anomaly or a mistake in the design of a life, but rather the shared weather of the human condition, a natural response to the profound depth of our capacity to care. It is the shadow cast by love, and to wish for an existence without the sting of loss would be to wish for an existence without the capacity for connection. The weight of this grief becomes lighter, not when we try to outrun it, but when we recognize that we are part of a vast, interconnected web of beings who are all navigating the same tides of arrival and departure. There is a quiet, steady dignity in acknowledging that everything we encounter is on loan from the infinite, and that the beauty of a thing often lies in its very fragility, in the fact that it cannot stay. When the mind ceases its frantic effort to manipulate the unfolding of time, a different kind of awareness begins to emerge, one that does not depend on the stability of the external world. Beneath the relentless torrent of thought, beneath the restless surface of memory and anticipation, there exists a depth that remains untouched by the storms of circumstance. It is a stillness that is not the absence of movement, but a profound presence that is so vast and so deep that the movement of the world no longer feels like a threat. This is the center of the cyclone, the silent witness that observes the rise and fall of every emotion and the passing of every thought without being swept away by them. In this depth, the self is revealed to be something far more expansive than the egoic construct that spends its days defending its borders and guarding its possessions. You are not the storm, nor are you the wind that drives it. You are the space in which the storm occurs. This realization does not diminish the intensity of living, but it changes the fundamental way in which the world is experienced. To hold the world with open hands, rather than with a clenched fist, is to allow the beauty of the passing moment to wash over you without the fear of its inevitable departure. It is to find a sense of home, not in the permanence of things, but in the unwavering reality of being. In this state, the distinction between the observer and the observed begins to dissolve, leaving only the quiet, luminous truth of existence, unfolding exactly as it must, with a grace that requires no permission and no defense. There was a man who lived on the edge of a village where the mountains met the mist, spending his days in a workshop filled with the scent of cedar shavings and the rhythmic scrape of files against iron. He repaired the things that had lost their way, mending the broken hinges of gates and the cracked handles of heavy wooden bowls, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate certainty that seemed to belong to another era. When the rains came in a great, unrelenting torrent and the canal overflowed its banks, a child was swept away by the churning silt, only to be pulled from the debris by the man who had been walking the path. At the precise moment the water rose, the village erupted in a fervor of celebration, bringing him bread, fine wines, and songs sung in his honor, casting him as a guardian of their peace. They stood at his gate with wide eyes and trembling voices, offering him the highest titles of respect, yet he merely looked at them with a gaze as clear as spring water and said, "Is that so?" before turning his back to tend to the heavy green vines of his tomato plants. The seasons turned, and the light shifted across the valley, bringing with it the slow, creeping movement of a different kind of current. A rumor began in the market, a whispered suspicion that grew in the dark corners of the tavern until it became a shadow that followed him through the streets. They said he was a man of hidden motives, a person of coldness and deceit, and soon the same hands that had offered him bread were used to point and accuse. When he walked through the square, the laughter died and the people stepped into the mud to avoid his path, their faces clouded with a sudden, unearned contempt. He heard the whispers of his character being dismantled by those who had once called him a hero, yet he only met their judging stares with that same quiet, unshakable presence and said, "Is that so?" before returning to the soil and the quiet work of his garden. Time, which moves with a heavy, inevitable weight, eventually washed the silt away from the truth. It was revealed through the honest testimony of a traveler that the accusations had been born of nothing more than fear and misunderstanding, a collective error that had cast a darkness where there was only light. The villagers returned to his gate with bowed heads, their eyes cast down in the heavy shame of those who realize they have been unkind to the innocent. They brought him gifts of apology and spoke of their regret, with voices thick with contrition, seeking a way to mend the bridge they had burned in their haste to judge. He looked upon their repentant faces, acknowledging the weight of their guilt without being pulled into its gravity, and said, "Is that so?" before reaching into the vines to harvest the bright ripening fruit of his garden to share with them. The praise and the blame had passed over him like a summer storm moving across the surface of a deep, ancient lake. The surface had taken the impact of the wind and the rain, but nothing had ever reached the still, silent place where he truly lived. The ripples on the surface of a pond are never the pond itself, though they may momentarily obscure the stones resting in the silt or the clarity of the depths below. There is a way the mind moves, a frantic and churning quality to the thoughts that arrive without invitation, crashing against the banks of the self with the force of a sudden gale. These movements, the sudden surge of anxiety, the heavy swell of grief, the sharp, jagged edges of self-judgment often feel as though they are the very essence of being, as if the storm were the entirety of the sky. It is a common human burden to mistake the weather for the atmosphere, to believe that because the wind is howling, the air itself has lost its nature. Yet, there is a dimension of existence that remains untouched by the turbulence, a vast and silent capacity that observes the movement of the clouds without being moved by them. This is the part of you that is not a collection of stories, not a repository of regrets, and not a vessel for the expectations of others. It is the quiet space in which the movement happens, the unchanging witness to the constant flux of becoming and passing away. The world often demands a reaction to every tremor, insisting that you must be the storm, that you must rise to meet every wave of emotion with an equal and opposite force. There is a profound exhaustion that comes from trying to govern the wind or to command the tides to cease their restless surging. Much of human suffering is born from this friction, the attempt to exert control over the uncontrollable, to hold tightly to the fleeting moment as if it were a solid object, and to resist the inevitable decay of all things. To live in constant opposition to the nature of change is to live in a state of perpetual war with reality. There is a different way to exist, one that recognizes that the impermanence of all things is not an enemy to be fought, but the very condition that allows life to unfold. If the river did not flow, it would become a stagnant pool. If the seasons did not turn, there would be no harvest. The very transience that causes such deep ache in the heart is the same grace that allows for renewal, for the possibility of a new morning, and for the ability to move beyond the versions of yourself that no longer serve the truth. In the midst of the noise, it is possible to recognize that you are not the thinker of the thoughts, but the space in which the thinking occurs. A thought arises, it stays for a duration, and it dissolves, leaving the void behind it unchanged. A feeling rises like a tide, it reaches its zenith, and it recedes, leaving the shoreline as it was before. When you begin to see the thoughts as mere phenomena, passing events in the landscape of consciousness rather than commands or definitions of your soul, the grip of the restless mind begins to lose its terror. You are the mountain that remains while the clouds drift by. You are the ocean that remains while the waves break and dissipate upon the shore. This is not a state of numbness or a refusal to engage with the world, but a state of profound presence where you can stand in the center of the chaos without being consumed by it. It is the realization that even the darkest shadows are only possible because there is a light that casts them, and that the shadow itself has no substance of its own. This stillness is not something that must be built or manufactured through effort or willpower, for it cannot be created by the mind that is currently in turmoil. Rather, it is something that is revealed when the agitation settles. It is the natural state that remains when the illusions of a permanent, separate ego are allowed to soften and fade. As the layers of attachment to being someone successful, someone failed, someone loved, someone alone, begin to thin, there is a sense of returning to a home that was never truly lost. There is a vastness that is both terrifying and deeply comforting, a realization that the boundaries of the self are far more porous and interconnected with the whole than the ego would ever care to admit. To accept the wholeness of being, including the parts that are broken and the parts that are hidden, is to finally stop fleeing from the self and to begin the long, slow process of being at peace with the mystery of existence. The river that flows before you is never the same river twice, for the water is in constant motion, even as the banks appear to hold a steady shape. It is a truth that permeates every facet of existence, from the slow turning of the seasons to the quiet, inevitable decay of the things we once thought were eternal. We often find ourselves standing in the midst of this movement, trying to build monuments out of sand, attempting to grasp the sunlight and pin it to the earth so that it might never fade. This resistance to the current is where the ache resides, for suffering is not the movement of change itself, but the frantic, white-knuckled grip we maintain against the inevitable tide. We demand that the bloom should never wilt, that the laughter of a loved one should echo in the hall forever, and that the circumstances of our lives should remain fixed in a shape of our own choosing. Yet, the very nature of being is to be in flux. To exist is to be part of a dance that requires constant movement, constant shedding, and constant becoming. Fortune and misfortune are merely different currents in the same vast ocean, rising and falling with a rhythm that is indifferent to our desires. We label some moments as good and others as bad. Yet these are but human interpretations of a cosmic flow that is neither benevolent nor cruel, but simply complete. To see this is to understand that the highs of life are not possessions to be stored in a vault, nor are the lows to be feared as permanent destinations. They are both weather patterns passing through the wide open sky of consciousness. Even the grief that feels so heavy and singular is a shared weather, a common atmosphere that every soul must eventually breathe, a testament to the fact that to love is to accept the eventual necessity of loss. There is a profound dignity in this shared vulnerability, a recognition that the capacity to feel the depth of an absence is the direct shadow of the capacity to feel the depth of a presence. When we finally cease our struggle against the vanishing moment, we discover that an ending is not a theft committed by time, but a completion of a cycle that was always meant to conclude. Nothing is truly stolen away when it passes. Rather, it is fully given, a gift that is offered to the totality of existence to fulfill its purpose in its own time. To hold what is beautiful with open hands is to participate in the grace of the universe, allowing the things we cherish to move through us rather than through us, leaving us changed but not depleted. This openness does not diminish the love we feel. It only removes the friction of our resistance, allowing the love to be a pure, unobstructed light that does not fear the coming of the dark. as the light wanes and the shadows lengthen, there is a quietude that arrives not from the absence of noise, but from the cessation of the internal struggle. It is the peace that comes when the day is allowed to conclude, not because the work is finished, but because the movement of the world has naturally drawn to a close. There is a certain wisdom in the way the light recedes, a silent surrender to the natural order that requires no effort and seeks no justification. The world does not demand anything from the fading sun. It simply accepts the transition from the brightness of being into the stillness of the unknown. There is a profound rest in this acceptance, a sense that all that has transpired throughout the day, the triumphs, the small anxieties, the fleeting joys, has been gathered into the wholeness of what has been. In this stillness, the self is no longer a fortress to be defended, but a vessel that is content to be emptied, finding a quiet repose in the simple, unadorned truth of being exactly where one is, part of a vast and unfolding stillness that has always been there. A man once lived in a house that sat at the edge of a great, salt-sprayed cliff, where the wind spoke in long, low tones against the stone. He was a man of precise habits, a collector of moments that he sought to preserve like pressed flowers between heavy glass plates. In his youth, he moved through the seasons with a certain frantic intensity, as if he could outrun the turning of the year by sheer force of will. When the golden warmth of summer began to pale into the bruised purple of autumn, he felt a resentment coil in his chest, a sense that the light was being stolen from him by an invisible thief. He spent much of his strength trying to build barriers against the inevitable, clutching at the fading heat of a July afternoon or the vibrant color of a leaf, only to find that the tighter he gripped these passing things, the more they seemed to wither in his hands, leaving him with nothing but the bitter residue of what used to be. He saw the passage of time as a series of subtractions, a slow emptying of the vessel that left him feeling depleted and robbed. Years passed, and the sharpness of that resentment softened into a quiet, observant stillness. Now, an old man resides in that same house, and his days are marked by a ritual that requires no ceremony, only a steady, unhurried presence. On his heavy wooden desk sits a single, unadorned candle, its wick long and its wax pale as bone. At the close of each day, when the sun has dipped below the horizon and the world is cast in shades of indigo and slate, he sits before it. He does not look at the clock or the shadows on the wall. He only watches the flame. The flame is a small, dancing thing, a bright, golden needle that stitches the darkness to the light. He has learned to see that the candle is not suffering as it burns, nor is it being consumed by some cruel necessity. It is simply expressing its nature. He watches the wax pool and soften, the liquid heat gathering in a small, clear lake at the base of the wick, and he understands that the light is beautiful precisely because it is being spent. The brilliance of the glow is inseparable from the slow, certain descent of the wax. The light is a gift that is being unwrapped, one moment at a time, until there is nothing left to unwrap. There was a time when he might have viewed the coming of the night as a failure of the day, a loss of the clarity and movement of the sun. Now he sees that the day is not a thing that is lost to the darkness, but a thing that is completed by it. A day that can never be reclaimed is not a day stolen from his life, but a day that has been fully and entirely given, a vessel that has been poured out until it is empty and pure. The final moments of the candle are the most profound, for they are the culmination of all the heat and light that came before. When the flame finally gutters, shivering for a moment before vanishing into a thin, silver thread of smoke, he does not reach out to shield the wick or mourn the sudden dimness. He simply sits in the quietude that follows, acknowledging the completion of the cycle, and allows the dark to be exactly what it is. The nature of all things is this constant, silent movement toward completion, a slow unfolding that mirrors the very rhythm of the stars as they trace their arcs across the void. You might find that the weight of the world is not found in the magnitude of what has happened, but in the friction of trying to hold on to what is already past. There is a peculiar kind of exhaustion that comes from the effort of grasping, a tiredness born from the attempt to make the temporary permanent, as if by holding tight enough, the river might stop its flow and stay forever in the palm of your hand. But the river is not meant to be held. It is meant to be witnessed, its movement a continuous succession of arrivals and departures that leave no trace of where they have been once they have moved on. To see this is to understand that the self is not a solid, unchanging monument, but a vast, open space through which 1,000 different versions of you pass, each one rising like a wave and receding back into the depth of an ocean that remains untouched by the turbulence of the surface. There is a profound truth in the realization that you are not the storm, nor are you the wind that drives it. You are the vastness in which the storm occurs, a quiet, underlying presence that remains even when the clouds have gathered and the lightning has struck. The thoughts that race through the mind, the anxieties that pull at the edges of your being, and the heavy shadows of judgment are merely weather, passing through a sky that is inherently clear and wide. To witness these things without the need to fix them, to see them as transient phenomena rather than as definitions of your soul, is to find a stillness that the world cannot grant and the world cannot take away. This is the essence of the wisdom that the Buddha spoke of when he taught that all conditioned things are impermanent. There is a liberation in accepting this truth, a lightness that arrives when you stop trying to build a fortress out of sand, in the path of a rising tide. It is possible to view the end of a cycle not as a depletion, but as a sacred returning to the source. The sun does not struggle against the horizon. It simply yields to the gravity of the coming night, knowing that its descent is a necessary part of the dance. There is a grace in this yielding, a quiet dignity in the way a day concludes, acknowledging that everything which has been lived fully, and that the act of letting go is not a loss, but the ultimate expression of having truly possessed the moment. The tension of the day often lies in the refusal to accept the transition, the stubborn desire to remain in the glare of the midday sun when the shadows have already begun to lengthen and the air has grown cool. Yet, the coolness is not an enemy of the warmth, but its natural companion, the silence that makes the music meaningful. As the light recedes, there is a subtle shifting of perspective, where the boundaries between the self and the world begin to soften and blur, revealing a wholeness that was always there, hidden beneath the noise of doing and the clamor of becoming. You may find that the most significant part of your existence is not found in the achievements you have gathered or the roles you have played, but in the silent, unobserved quality of being that remains when all the movement has ceased. This is the peace of the void, a state of profound emptiness that is not a lack of substance, but a fullness of potential, a stillness that is not the absence of life, but the very foundation of it. In the quietude of a finished day, there is a sense that everything is exactly as it must be, that the unfolding has been perfect in its imperfection, and that the stillness waiting in the dark is not a void to be feared, but a quiet sanctuary where the soul finds its way back to the original, unconditioned light.